There are so many interesting Nintendo controllers out there, so I thought it would be great to make a video ranking every single one. And I mean all of them. Any variants that were developed by Nintendo are on this list. Now real quick, I wanted to throw out 3 honorable mentions that I couldn't get because they were way too expensive to buy. And that includes the N64 IQ Player Controller, the N64 Mouse, and the NES HFC. So with that, let's get her ranked. 26. SNES Super Scope. Now yes, this is technically an accessory, but I'm counting the Super Scope as a controller because you do control games with it. And it's honestly the only Nintendo controller I don't like. I mean, sure, the design overall is pretty cool, I can't deny that, and this thing is a freaking honker. It's so big that it requires 6 AA batteries just to work. But that's not the issue. My real frustration is with the accuracy. I feel like my shots only work when they feel like working, which is kind of a problem for something that's supposed to be precise. Maybe my TV is the issue, I don't know. But that doesn't explain why the shooting button is on the top of the gun. Why? They even carved out a spot for the trigger but put the button on the top? I just don't understand that at all. 25. Wii Speak. So here's the thing with this mic. It's actually pretty decent in quality and works well with Animal Crossing Wild World. Or should I say, did work well. Now that the internet connection no longer works on the Wii, this mic is nothing more than a dead weight. I've never in my life had a controller that's functionally fine no longer able to work because of the internet. That alone makes this one of the most useless controllers of all time since it can't be utilized offline. 24. NES Power Pad. You know, I do love that name, the Power Pad. It's so 80s. I mean, just look at how colorful and taggy this thing is. And I mean that in a good way, I promise. While this is a decent pad, only a couple games work with it. And since you're playing NES games, it doesn't feel any more immersive than just using a controller. 23. N64 Microphone. Obviously, Wii Speak has a better microphone than this one, but at least this still works. And when I say works, I mean that sounds are picked up, but it doesn't articulate actual words. Yes, we're talking about Hey You Pikachu, one of the worst Pokemon games of all time. It seems like this mic does a bad job deciphering language. All that happens is Pikachu yells at me because he thinks I said something I didn't say. And maybe it's just the game, but even if it is, look at this mic and just how cheap and just crappy it is. 22. GameCube Microphone. This is pretty similar to the N64 mic, but it has much better accuracy with words. I used this a lot with the Mario Party games and rarely had issues with it. It was compatible with a few more games than the N64 mic was, but it's still pretty underutilized throughout the GameCube's library. 21. NES Zapper. With all the shooting items in Smash Bros, I'm surprised that this hasn't been added like the Super Scope was back in Melee. The Zapper feels pretty great. The trigger even has a nice little spring sound. While it does work with some games like Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley, you basically have to have a TV from the 80s for it to work. But despite that, they still tend to work pretty well, even for being such an old controller. 20. SNES Mouse. Here's another controller that was only supposed to be for one game, Mario Paint. It ended up being so good that dozens of SNES games added support for this mouse. The buttons don't click exactly like a real mouse does, but they still feel pretty solid. Moving around is also surprisingly responsive and accurate, albeit the movement speed on my end was a touch slow. Mario Paint wouldn't have worked with a normal controller, so its inclusion added all of its worth and value. 19. GameCube DK Bongos. So real quick, I know Namco developed Donkey Konga and Nintendo only published the game, but there's been some debate that Nintendo themselves created the bongos. I couldn't really find out if they did or not, but I'm adding them to the list anyway because these things are just so neat. You got 2 big bongos to slap, 1 button on the side, and a mic that can pick up clapping. Slapping the bongos just feels so nice. They've got a really good bounce to them. They are really loud, however, so this is a game you probably can't play with people in the same room. But I mean, come on, you can't go wrong with bongo controllers. 18. Wii Balance Board. I remember when this was the biggest craze back in the Wii days, and even now the balance board is still rather impressive. It's easy to hook up, has a good battery life, it can measure your weight and sense where the weight is coming from. It made for a lot of really fun and interesting minigames. I never actually lost weight with the balance board, but I love that it was used in a few games beyond Wii Fit, like Super Monkey Ball Step and Roll, and even Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games. 17. Switch Pokeball Plus. I'm honestly still baffled this exists. It's really too bad it has such an awkward feel to it. There's only two buttons, one at the top and the little analog stick in the middle which can be pushed down. I tried playing some of Pokemon Let's Go with this controller, and well, it's just not very comfortable. The biggest problem is my hand cramps up when playing for too long, and the gyrometer seems to only work sometimes, but maybe I'm just using it wrong or something. I do love how it plays Pokemon Center music when you charge it though. And of course, the Pokemon cries from inside the ball are so charming. It's neat that you can play the entire game with it, I just wish it had an extra button or maybe it was a little bit bigger. 16. Virtual Boy Controller. Where do I even begin with this? Well, I guess I'll admit that the ergonomics are good, it does mesh with your hands pretty well, but why are there two D-pads? An analog stick on one side would have made a lot more sense. I'm also not a fan of where start and select are placed. These kinds of buttons should be more discreet because they aren't meant to be easy to push. That's why they're usually small and out of the way on every other controller. But I guess it kind of makes sense for this since the Virtual Boy, you can't see where you're looking with the headset on. And also, what's with the shoulder buttons? These are like the lamest shoulder buttons I've ever seen. They don't feel distinct at all. I mean, this controller is functional, I guess, but it just feels like a step back. 15. N64 Controller. There's a lot of great and horrible things going on here. Firstly, this controller is really innovative with it being the first ever trigger button on the back, an analog stick for home consoles, and the rumble/controller packs you can attach. Unfortunately, the stick is horrible. I have a few controllers and none of them work very well anymore. And to address the elephant in the room, yeah, this controller's design is stupid. This three-pronged shape just doesn't make any sense, but I find it to be pretty comfortable and most games choose between using the D-pad or analog, so it works out. Want to play Pokemon Puzzle League? You use the D-pad side. Want to play Mario 64? Use the analog side. 14. NES Max. I can see some people disagreeing with me having this so low on the list, but let me explain. I do think this controller has a nice grip to it, and the addition of the turbo buttons is appreciated too, but something about all the buttons just feels off. A and B in the turbo buttons look like the traditional 4-button layout, but kind of turned to its side, and it comes off as awkward to use. And what is with this circle pad? The D-pad itself works fine, but there's zero reason for this little knob to exist for games that only move in 4 or 8 directions to begin with. 13. Wii Remote/Nunchuck. These things get a bad rap nowadays, but I don't think they're complete cancer. The motion controls in some of the games work really well, assuming you're using Motion Plus, of course. The buttons have a nice feel to them. There's an attachable nunchuck with a prominent analog stick, there's a speaker that plays game sounds sometimes, and I love that you can power the console on and off right from the remote. But sadly, there are a lot of games that forced in motion controls, which in turn kind of ruin the games that could have been great. And trying to play games with the remote held sideways really sucks. There just isn't much to grip to, and both sides are inconsistent, which makes for a clumsy experience. 12. SNES Scoremaster. Here's a controller that's clearly made for something like Street Fighter 2. I didn't even know it existed until I did research for this video. There's so much on this panel. You got the joystick, the 6 main buttons, and turbo switches for each individual button, all with different speeds. That's a lot of customization for a controller. The buttons are a great size too and have a good click to them. However, my A button didn't respond very well, but that could just be from age because all the other buttons were perfect. The joystick also feels a tad bit stiff, but it worked a lot better than I expected it to. You can easily set this on a table or even your lap and have a great time with this. 11. NES Advantage. Like the Scoremaster, this controller has a wide variety of buttons you can use. Of course, there's the joystick, the other main buttons, a slow button which only works for some games, and 2 turbo buttons that has a dial to control the speed of the turbo. While there's less features on the Advantage compared to the Scoremaster, I found this controller works a lot better. It's just a bit more compact, as well as the buttons and joystick being more responsive. I honestly didn't think the joystick was going to be this fluid, but it works perfectly with any game you're playing on top of fighting games. 10. NES Controller. What else needs to be said about this iconic controller? The design is absolutely classic. The buttons and D-pad feel great despite being a tad mushy. Some people have complained about the sharp edges, but I've personally never been bothered with them. I suppose it depends on the size of your hands. I'll mention the Famicom controllers too because they function pretty much the same, outside of the second controller having a mic for some reason. 9. Wii U Gamepad. Yes, obviously there's a lot of flaws. The touchscreen is only one touch, the battery life is horrible, and it doesn't hold a charge for very long. There's a camera for really no good reason, and the TV button was hardly used at all. But even with all of that, I still kinda love this thing. Despite the size, the gamepad molds with your hands really nicely, and it has a great weight. All the buttons feel fantastic, the quality is supreme in that department, and the gyro controls are perfected. Say hi to a little game called Splatoon. So as clumsy as this controller looks, I'm glad it exists and still enjoy using it whenever I need to pop in a Wii U game. 8. NES Controller 2 or the dog bone. This is one of the best redesigns I've ever seen a controller get. The spoon-shaped sides feel amazing on your hands. The buttons are much crisper and more responsive than the original, and while the A and B buttons are placed a bit weird, they still work out pretty fine. If anyone is getting into retro gaming, spend the extra money to get a dog mode controller. It's absolutely worth it. 7. Switch Joy-Cons. These are some of the most advanced controllers ever conceived. You got the HD rumble, the buttons on the sides, the NFC reader, the capture button, the tiny IR camera. It's insane how much technology is crammed into these. The only real issue is they're just too small. I can cup an entire Joy-Con in my hand, and that's not really a good thing. And the ZL/ZR buttons are atrocious unless you add that Joy-Con grip, but nobody wants to deal with those considering how difficult they are to take off. 6. Wii Classic Controller. The buttons and joystick have a really clean feel to them. In fact, this is one of the best D-pads I've ever used. There is of course some weird things going on, like these awkwardly placed ZL and ZR buttons. I'm not sure why they're on the sides like that, but because the controller is shaped like an oval, they're surprisingly easy and natural to reach. And why doesn't anyone bring up that this controller has analog triggers? I adore that Nintendo included this since they often don't with their controllers. There is of course some strange quirks, like the cord being on the bottom, plus there's this button in the middle that opens and closes these slots. I'm guessing it was supposed to be for an accessory, but I don't think it was ever actually utilized for anything. 5. Wii Classic Pro. This is basically the Wii Classic Controller, but slightly better. While sadly it removed the analog triggers, it does position the ZL and ZR buttons in better spots, so I guess it's a fair trade-off. The shape is also more natural. I've got a bit of a better grip to hold on with. And they even fixed that cord issue and stuck the end back on the top like it's supposed to be. 4. SNES Controller. This controller is legendary and speaks volumes for the game industry as a whole. It's standardized how most controllers look today with the 4-button layout, and with the shoulder buttons too. It's not even just that, but everything about this controller was thoroughly thought out and well constructed. As an example, let's analyze the face buttons. The Y and X buttons have outer lips which give the tip of your thumb more grip. The B and A buttons are smoother on purpose so that you can easily push down Y and B at the same time, or X and A at the same time. Most controllers don't go to this extent of detail, but it really pays off. The only thing I don't like are the start and select buttons, as they feel too mushy, but otherwise this thing kicks ass. 3. Wii U Pro Controller. This has to be one of the most overlooked controllers of all time because everyone just talked about the gamepad. This is incredibly comfortable to hold. Every button feels amazing and they're all sized just right. And the battery life, get this, can go for 80 hours. Yeah. 80 hours is ridiculous on one charge. The only thing this needed was some analog triggers, but otherwise it's a gem. 2. GameCube Controller / WaveBird. This controller is so good that Nintendo hasn't gotten rid of it for all the new Smash Bros. Games. Now at first glance, you might look at this thing and go, huh? Why are all the buttons so different and funky looking? The different sizes all signify varying levels of importance. The A button is nice and big, showing it's going to be the main button you use, with B being a bit lower as the second main button. Y and X wrap around A for convenience sake and is used for things like jumping or swapping stuff around. And the joystick has to be one of the best I've ever used and even has little notches to help you move perfectly straight if need be. And those shoulder buttons, ooh, they're just orgasmic. It's the best shoulder buttons Nintendo has ever created. Really, the only flaws with this controller is the D-pad being a little small, and it seems strange to only have one Z button when they could have added two. And real quick, the WaveBird is basically the same thing, but wireless. Now, it's not just a wireless controller, it's one of the first to use radio signals, which is significantly better than most wireless controllers back in the day that forced you to face the console for them to work. And number 1 is the Switch Pro Controller. This may not be a perfect controller, but it's about as close to perfection as you can get. Every button in the joysticks are nice and meaty, and the shoulder buttons feel fantastic. The grips are just mesmerizing. You can hold this thing for hours on end with zero discomfort. The battery life is phenomenal on this as well, and uses USB-C to charge. The gyro controllers and HD rumble really make this stand out compared to the PS4 and Xbox One controllers, plus they even fit the NFC reader and capture button inside. The only thing that could have been improved was the shoulder buttons being analog, but otherwise it lives up to its name. It truly is a Pro Controller. And that's gonna wrap things up. That is until Nintendo makes some more controllers, but that—
Hold on just a hot second.
Huh?
You're forgetting about the NJS 3D1.
And what is that exactly?
This guy, the Nintendo 3D1 joystick for PC. This is a fully featured flight stick licensed by Nintendo exclusively for use with home computers. In fact, this is the only official Nintendo controller which doesn't work with any Nintendo home console. Plus, it's got a pretty weird backstory with some questionable licensing issues.
I see. Well, if you'd like more info on this controller, you can check out Nintendo's newest video on it right now. But with that, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching.